Joanna.
I wasn't in the 21st century. That's really cool.
It's a big improvement. Welcome to the June 12th, 2025 meeting of the Housing Blue Ribbon Committee. Let's do the roll call. Dagan?
Here.
John?
Here.
Harry?
Here.
Eric?
Here.
Andrew?
Here.
Teresa Kozak?
Here.
Jen Stebbins Thomas is not with us. Joanna Kelly is joining us via Zoom. Byron Maddow cannot make it tonight.
And Megan.
And Megan cannot make it tonight.
And Beth.
And Beth.
And Beth also has a work conflict. Came up today.
Assistant Mayor, can you hear us?
I can. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Welcome. Okay, we had a big batch of minutes. Any?
To get the ball rolling, I'll move we approve.
Well, I had a change. Did anybody
No, that's
else?
fine. You certainly.
I have just some questions after. I mean, I don't object to them, but I just I read through them and there was just some issues, not issues, but just questions about the status of city property now. A lot of it was very specific with pieces of property that I think some decisions have been made on them.
Why don't we return to that after
Yep.
we vote the motion?
Absolutely.
Anybody have corrections? If not, I will note that March 13th minutes, the third page refers to a motion under my name, and that was actually Jen Stebbins Thomas who made that motion. So, John, as amended?
You got it.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Eric, I'm not sure we can answer your question, but
I just want to know, as it stands right now, with all the pieces of property that we have discussed, and maybe eliminated, what is left standing for city property that could be used for housing? And I think the only thing that remains with any prospect, but maybe dim, is the little parking lot. Granite Street was refused by the condo association, right?
Right.
And the other pieces just never really got out of the gate. They were too small. So what is the final tally? Just the lower parking lot, possibly?
everything is still available. Only two were recommended to the council. So, and we didn't get the add-on piece for Granite Street, so the only one recommended to the council by us so far is
That's it. So that's the one piece that has any prospect, but hasn't really got out of.
city manager was asked for a report back, so the council will get a report back on the feasibility of using that, particularly vis-a-vis parking needs and whether we start construction on
Who's doing that?
city manager. Report back.
The report?
Yeah.
Is the city doing it or like RKG?
I think it's just staff.
John?
Yeah.
Just for political ease, when you say that those were recommended, just for the record, the others are not off the table.
That's right.
So I just want to make sure that we understand that. Then the second thing I just want to ask about, if I can, where do we stand on Commerce Way and property up there?
I can comment on that.
Yeah, you may know better than I, Peter.
So there's a project coming before the planning board for design review next week. And as part of that project, the developer was gonna, provide the city a piece of land that hasn't really been identified or fleshed out yet, so that will be forthcoming, I think,
Okay,
next few months.
good. Thank you. So, I mean, when we talk about properties that are available for our intent, that would fall into that
Absolutely,
area.
yeah.
And So it's just not one option, there's at least another option available.
Yes.
Yep, okay. Thank you.
Yes. Andrew?
Sorry, back to the lower parking lot conversation. What is the scope of the manager's report?
I'd have to go back to that meeting. As Assistant
Did I
Mayor,
miss
you
that meeting?
remember?
Am I behind?
I believe it was just a general staff kind of outline opinion of possible construction on the lower lot. I will say I think that the desire of the council, and publicly I think the mayor has stated, that he really wanted to kind of hold off on other city properties until the GNOD property was located, because part of that agreement was to make sure that it was a buildable lot, and kind of not easy, but easily or constructed lot that has the ability to hold at least 80 units. So I think, in the conversation with the council when this was discussed was to kind of see where the plans unfold with that, as that being the next possible site, because it will be a municipal owned site once the land is transferred.
Right.
So, to clarify, Assistant Mayor, the lower parking lot is in the backseat position to that to be identified lot.
In my opinion, that is what I inferred from that meeting when we were talking about the city gaining that site over there.
The only thing I'm getting at here, not to belabor their point, is that if we have a report going out for this lower lot, I want to understand the scope a little bit more so that it's just not kind of aimless. Obviously, there are parking considerations, there's architectural and historic considerations, there are neighborhood considerations. So I'm just trying to figure out when I need to pay attention to that.
Yeah, I would say that I would not, we asked the manager for, I believe, gave the manager and staff a few months as we were, heading into heavy budget season. So I would assume that we would get a report back. And if there's clarification on that, we can ask the city manager for clarification for this committee to kind of look at what scope her and her staff were looking at for feedback.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the sequence has been, we deliberated, we said, we ought to put housing in the lower lot.
Yeah.
That came to the council said, how feasible is that, city manager? We'll get the report back. And then we'll really take it up and deliberate on it. But I think Joanna's right, we wanna first nail down the GNOD Commerce Way property,
For sure.
because
Just by nature of the zoning alone, that has more feasibility than the lower lot.
right, because that with that parcel's part of a whole much bigger surge in housing supply, if everything comes true in that Commerce Way site.
But for the lower lot, we've seen the success of the Ruth building as well, and know that bringing more housing downtown in a walkable area is also great. So I think just more housing overall, but yeah.
Yes, I mean, myself, I like the idea of housing on the lower lot. I think you can put the parking underneath. It's very close to downtown. It's great proximity for workforce. I had expected much more neighborhood voices to come out, but it's early in the game.
That was a very political way to say push back.
I guess that's my best I can put.
And there has been no indication with the property exchange, no idea what is gonna be offered to the city for the property exchange?
It's not a property exchange.
Not yet. I think they're still trying to figure out where, it has to be an acre, at least.
Acre and a half.
Acre and a half. I think their team is still working out what would work before they present it to the city.
Is that minimum of an acre, or with what's being exchanged, would it include more than an acre?
I think it has to be at least an acre.
At least an acre.
And just because this work and sometimes It's not an exchange, the city's not giving a parcel of land,
Okay,
there's no exchanging of parcels for
Right,
city-owned
it's-
property for city-owned property.
Right. For development of workforce housing in the GNOD, they have three options. They can build workforce housing, do a payment in lieu of, or do a land transfer. And I think they're leaning towards the land
if
transfer.
exchange is the wrong word, my
Right, yeah.
apologies, but just to have an idea of what might be in, you know, in the scope of that.
Any more discussion on GNOD, lower lot, other parcels? If not, we can move on to the third item on our agenda, which is the zoning area, zoning barriers. As you recall, the council tasked us with a list of zoning barriers that we could advise should be taken up in the master plan or sooner, that we can increase the supply of housing. And Peter updated the memo that we've been working with on that. So I'll just review those quickly and then we'll go into discussion. First was move parking requirements from zoning to site plan regulations for non-residential projects and residential projects with 3 or more dwelling units. So this essentially, for those larger projects, would get rid of the whole table of parking requirements. The whole table that says this many units, this many parking spaces.
For the small number.
Things that require site plan review, so take out zoning and put it into the site plan regs, it allows more flexibility. The planning board has a desire to do that. So it's kind of being worked on when staff has time.
But that would be near term. I mean,
Right,
that
right.
could potentially go through 3 readings and be done this year. Next was review lot sizes and frontages for all residential districts to look at changing requirements to better align with actual sizes and frontage, which will allow for infill development and decrease non-conforming lots. And I think the eye opener was Peter's chart that he gave you, that we've got 6 residential zones. 3 of those, more than 50% of the lots are already non-conforming. So, we've sort of artificially put this scheme over the existing 100-year-old, 75-year-old housing. The majority in many of our neighborhoods, it doesn't conform. So that was an indication that we really should open that up and allow ways to increase density.
But I would also add that most of those houses were in place prior to zoning. So it's not a situation where zoning has been in place and these houses have been built, non-conforming. These are pre-existing, if you will, for lack of a better term.
And correct me if I'm wrong, most of our residential zones have 100-foot frontage that's required.
It varies, but 150 feet I think is the max.
Yeah.
But it's I think some have 70, 80, 100, 150.
So in other words, if you tore a house down that was non-conforming, that had less than 100.
Right, you would need, or the less than the required lot area, then you would have to get variances. And we see that often at the zoning board.
Yeah, that happens all the time.
So, go ahead.
It's also just not a silver bullet solution to get to smaller lot sizes, is not by changing the frontage. For example, I think we talked about last time how many variations and influences can happen with single-family zoning, i.e. Elwyn Park or the greater Elwyn Park area versus where I am on Jones Ave. And where Jones Ave might have a lot more frontage, but we also don't have public utility. We don't have public sewer. So there are just too many variations to just blanket statement, it's 9 zones, therefore we can change it based on these criteria. Where I get that the goal is to eliminate as many variances or eliminate the demand for so many meetings, so to speak. But at the same time, I think these criteria are less so about the red tape or the protections, but more about just the nature of what we have, the topography, variations in utility, density, pre-existing density, or the neighborhood context. And I fully agree with what we're talking about. It's just that there are so many different layers to how do you really achieve that?
Yes. And that gets very technical very fast.
Extremely.
Yeah.
And our zoning for single family lots is the clearest of the zoning that we have, in my opinion. But with that said, you know, I've been working on a 1 acre lot in town, where I would still have to pursue a variance for the frontage, and it has 90 feet instead of 110 per the zone. So to me, that's just another hurdle of time, money, and energy to go get a variance for 90 feet instead of 110, where it's to the naked eye, that's almost negligible. And I think lot size is maybe a more fundamental change to be considered in frontage.
Right, valid point.
I'm happy to hear a nay say, or change, you know, altering
No, I
opinions
mean,
there.
I mean, I think that's very true, and the fact is that, you know, I think that what we have right now does create, you know, additional work, as Andrew's saying, in some particular situations. But there is a way to resolve that, and, you know, it can be handled appropriately. I think one of the other things too is that, you know, we've also seen, at least over in my neighborhood, there's a house that has, you know, a good sized lot. They're putting in an ADU, and that's certainly a way to address it, because, and again, I don't pretend to understand everything, but, you know, that gives you a lot more flexibility relative to frontage, et cetera, when you're doing that type of thing, as opposed to, you know, separating the lots and have two tiny, you know, fairly tiny lots.
I don't think where I live in, you know, Panaway, Coltville, Holly Lane, I'd say there's 100% that don't meet the
Sure.
Which is why
frontage, right?
when people rebuild, they use the same, when people are rebuilding in Panaway, it's the same basement, and so it's just like a funny,
Right.
they just go up.
Because that's for zoning.
Yes.
Because then you don't have to pursue a certain permit.
Right.
You don't have to go and argue about setbacks and talk to your neighbors necessarily. It's
I
just,
think almost with we get a lot of variance notifications for anyone, yeah.
Yeah, in my neighborhood's residential B, and, you know, it's like the city as a whole. 64% of the city's non-conforming, I'd say 75% of my neighborhood's non-conforming. So we're getting abutter notices all the time.
and
So how are we gonna move forward? Let's
So
figure
yeah,
out.
is there a question?
So the council is looking for a report back on barriers to zoning and barriers to, you know, in zoning that impact the opportunity for more housing. And something like this should certainly be taken up during the master plan process.
Mhm.
And so I think you can just identify that. I mean, they're looking for a report back on the 23rd.
23rd.
So
So
if I can,
This is just one item that, hey, this should be looked at. considered in the
Yeah,
master
and they're
plan.
not looking for recommendations, they're just looking for items that.
Right, barriers, yeah.
Barriers,
Very-
okay,
Can be general like
Super,
this.
yeah. done, that is one.
Yeah, I mean,
And the way I bulleted, this is what was discussed at the last housing meeting, kind of in general, so we're kind of
Yeah.
bringing it back to, was this what you discussed? Are there other items? I think the co-chairs will have an update on discussions they had with developers to add to this list, but I think it's just a list that goes back to the council, say, hey, these are the things that we've identified, and something like taking the parking out, I think the planning board's working on that, but other items really should be taken up in this upcoming master plan process.
And some of them should not be taken up. For instance, I would argue that wetlands and making changes to our wetlands, even though it might make some properties more available, it's not on our list. So, I mean, I would argue that it shouldn't be on our list, but I think that's another item that certainly is a barrier. I mean, if we're just making a list of barriers, then obviously the wetlands ordinance is a barrier.
Sure.
I mean, I'd be hard pressed to think changing anything about the wetlands is going
I
to
agree with you
yield a
completely.
material benefit.
No,
but-
I agree with you completely,
I
but
hear what
as I
you're
say,
saying.
if our purpose is to come up with barriers,
I didn't want you to get skewered when people listen to the live
Yeah.
feedback.
Yes.
Our big audience that we have, I didn't want people to be like, that guy wasn't check wetlands.
Assistant Mayor?
I was just gonna say, I understand what you're saying, Mr. O'Leary, but I also think it's within the agreement, or in my sense, moral concept of the committee that, if we don't wanna add wetland barriers, we don't need to add them to the list. Well, I agree with you in the sense they are a barrier. If they're not something that this committee feels is in their purview, which I don't, in my purview, like the wetlands are not within my purview per se. That would come from the Conservation Commission or the Planning Board. I don't think we need to add it. Yeah.
I mean,
A lot of it is state
I would
statute.
I would say, in my opinion, and I respect yours, I would say that we discussed it and decided it wasn't one that should be addressed, and put it to bed so nobody questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there other issues in that? I mean, in the broader, wetlands has been identified, but is it in the broad term environmental, aspects?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, having been on both sides of that coin, both on the planning board and Concom side, as well as the development side, I think this list is a self-identifier list, almost as if you're making a SWOT analysis of yourself. And we can hand that to this consultant during the master plan process and say, hey, look, here's what we've self-identified as this committee, as a organization or entity. And we just kind of talked about how lot size is up here, and then maybe lot frontage. And then sure, there's a healthy gap on this list, and then wetlands. Now, with that said, I think it's helpful to have it on there, and I don't know whose point this was, but anytime we have a redevelopment within the city and it is encroaching or getting close to the wetlands, more often than not, it's talking about the lack of drainage or the lack of sophistication to that lot. So where like sheet flows are just going into Hodgins Brook, Weston Yards, even though it was a massive impact, there was a improvement,
A plan, yeah.
a structural improvement to what was there previously. So while it may not be the first thing to change, it's still important to recognize because, again, more often than not, through development or through manipulating property, we get better drainage or better utilities out of that and more protections to that wetland.
I agree.
Tracy, you.
Maybe this is buried somewhere else, but a lot coverage, setbacks, and height certainly play into zoning density. Has that been considered?
We didn't talk about setbacks and height. We did talk about
Lot coverage,
square lot coverage.
I think lot coverage is like a bullet point underneath the lot size.
What would be the difference between frontage and setbacks?
Setbacks are how close you
How
are
far
building
is
to
the
the
side?
property line.
This is my house.
Yes, okay, so
This
the
is the
frontage is
frontage.
just,
This is how far back it is from the property lines.
okay.
The frontage is, how long is your property line along the street?
Oh, okay.
Street frontage is,
Oh, okay, street frontage.
yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think those there's certainly a lot of non-conforming lots on those items in many of these districts as well.
So would you recommend that second bullet point adding in better align with actual sizes, comma, frontage, setbacks, and height requirements?
Sure. I mean,
You
it'll
just-
certainly
I think
barriers.
you want, you could just say dimensional requirements.
Exactly.
That,
Thank you.
that encompasses height, coverage, setbacks.
Thank you.
Spoken by the expert.
In my head, I've been thinking about this as almost like a pie chart. If you have a pie chart of all of the residential properties in Portsmouth, and we are talking about some of these criteria, and if we start changing these criteria, how many or at what percentage of the residential properties in Portsmouth would that change affect? So if we're talking about lot size, and if we change the lot size, that would affect, let's say 80%. I don't know. Let's say it affects 80%. Okay, that's interesting. If we change the lot frontage, maybe that affects 60%, as an example. So I think that is a good visual indication in my head, at least, of how we prioritize these things and hand them to a consultant.
Yeah, and I also think it could be goal-oriented. If we wanted to get a 10% or 20% increase in density, what would it take?
That's a really interesting line to toe.
But it's beyond where we are right now.
You could inquire with Portland, Maine about that, because they have gone through similar changes and have seen different results. I would say that they probably don't have 100% buy-in from their constituents on that one.
Absolutely. I said to the council one night, each neighborhood has to come up to a level of density it's comfortable with.
I would argue that sometimes being comfortable is something that you can push and change on too, though. There are probably neighborhoods that wouldn't find the density in my neighborhood to be comfortable, but I actually find it to be less dense than maybe it could be. So I think what's comfortable for one and what's comfortable for the loudest group might not serve the affordability of Portsmouth overhaul. So I would argue that.
And people are inherently uncomfortable with change, so if you tell them you're going to
Bingo.
change something about their neighborhood, they're going to be
And I
resistant.
think that, again, it depends on the constituency we're talking about. I agree with you, Mary, but I think that most people, frankly, in their neighborhoods are comfortable with what they have. Somebody looking at those dimensional aspects being introduced into their neighborhood would be uncomfortable with it. But most people, when people buy a house, they buy a house on how it feels to them.
Mhm.
So obviously somebody who, had an impression of having a large yard and, distance from neighbors wouldn't have bought a house in Panaway, so.
Right.
Yeah.
But you don't own your view, and
No,
you don't.
no.
And if you think about who's able to buy houses right now in this town, it's almost nobody of my generation. Almost none of us can afford to buy a house. I'm very lucky that I could access that, but I think when we're talking about it's about creating opportunities for growing generational wealth in that way too. So it is a broader understanding. So I would just hope that when we're having these conversations about the zoning to look into, that maybe we could consider some of the density aspects of it as well.
It's really good to hear you say that, Mary, because I'm thinking, I'm 70 years old and a longtime resident. And so we need to hear from people who are 35 and want to buy a house.
Mhm.
And, when it comes down to the balance, we need to tip in favor of future people who want to buy a house.
Or 25,
Yeah.
People,
Just a quick comment on that if I can. I think that's part of, I agree with everyone in the room right now. The broader conversation is not only about affordability, but attainability. We hear constantly people say, well, my kids can't find anywhere to live in the place that they grew up. That's not just people at 60, 80, or 100% median income. That's people at 120% median income. And there's no availability in the market in general, even if they could afford a home on the higher end or an apartment on the higher end. So I think we need to also make sure that we're having that view within the realm of affordability and attainability and accessibility. As Mary just said, some of the bigger things that we hear are people saying, my kids have nowhere they want to buy a home here and they can't, not just because of price, but because there's nothing available. There's a limited inventory.
And we should be conscientious of the unintended consequences of the things that we want to push,
Sure.
and see come to fruition. But we also need to recognize the consequences of years and years of what we've been seeing. Like I thought I was moving into a neighborhood and my next door neighbors run a short-term rental. Like that's an unintended consequence of the type of lack of enforcement that we're capable of as a city that's affecting the overall housing market.
Just like everyone can throw open their mouth at this statement, but like outside of zoning and planning is supply and demand.
Sure.
And it is a factual statement that for the better part of 50 years, Portsmouth has always, without fail, gone up year over year in property appreciation values. That is something that you will not control. However, with the stipulation that you add more supply through zoning, you can get more towards the attainability, but maybe not the affordability piece. Maybe. Now, there are market conditions changing every single day. In the last 3 weeks alone, we have seen 3 or 4 times as many properties in the last 3 months come and sit on the market. Now, if you divide your lot size in half, and I'm looking at Panaway Manor in particular, like that would not necessarily change the character of Panaway Manor to look like Atlantic Heights, where you have twice as many units in the same amount of structures. Because it's a proactive, or I should say, like it's an engagement style change to zoning, where you need to get, whether it's a property owner, developer, builder, buyer, etc., to actually do that work. So the zoning is a start, but then it is the participation, engagement, and acknowledgement of the market to start doing those things. And so long as real estate is real estate, people will probably be pursuing profits in that regard. And so if you still create the twice as many units, it's going to be based on demand.
And, the other thing too is that it's like we were talking, a couple of months ago now. Even if we change the dimensions and someone has a piece of property that, let's just say, that can be, it's 100-foot frontage and it can be cut into 2 lots. Somebody has to take down the existing building and build 2 more buildings. Is that going to end up with something that's affordable? No. That's the reality. So, we're talking about these things as barriers, but whether or not it comes, it produces the results that some people would like to see, is in my mind questionable. So
I totally agree. I mean, it's all in the hands of who's creating it, whether it's a developer, whether it's, something already existing. I don't think we have a complete formulation or a formula that's going to get us out of the situation. It's just, we're going to be chasing it, and we're chasing it right now. I think we're doing very proactive things for it, but we're competing against a force, of developers or people who wanna maintain some type of, higher level of profit out of their, it's an asset. So
Yeah,
I think the discussion is worthy. I don't know that we're gonna come up with the formula for solving it, but we can only try, that's it.
Yeah, I think, Andrew, you said we could maybe get more attainability by increased supply, but we might not get affordability. And I have a friend, their backyard neighbor sold a house on Wybird. It's now 2 houses and an ADU. It sold for $800,000. The 2 units are going for 1.5. So, we've added density, but the market demand is so strong that, you've seen this, Tracy, right? We set out through master plans from 2005 on to have a historic, walkable, attractive city with a great art scene, and everybody wants to live here.
Right, and then the people who own the houses, someone who may have lived here for 40 years and bought a house for $32,000, they want to get the most they can get out of their property, and in some cases, especially if they're near retirement, they want that money to help, frankly, fund their retirement. So they're not going to, it was kind of interesting, we've been kind of talking a little bit about Panaway, and the fact is that, as I'm saying, even if you had a big lot in Panaway and somebody bought it for $400,000, which would be a pretty good deal, and divided it into 2 pieces of property and built 2 houses there, what would they sell them for? They've got $200,000 split it, 400 split twice, $200,000 just in the lot. Then you're building a house on top of it, so it doesn't afford to build. Now, I also know we were talking about people not being able to have their children stay in. I know somebody who, bought a house because the people who owned it wanted to give them a good deal because they grew up in the neighborhood. So they sold them a house for a reasonable price. And, as Mary's saying, those are the people who can stay in town and who've got the quote unquote personal connections. If you don't have those personal connections, then you're paying market rate, and it's real money. Yeah.
But supply and demand is a pretty well vetted economic concept. And as you increase supply, it creates more competition. If you want to compete, sometimes you have to take less in the way of profit. I also think one of the things that's kind of the subtext of what we're saying here is that it's even more important for us to be pursuing partnerships with non-for-profits so that we are not competing against the free market.
Yeah, I agree with you.
That's right, because if demand for housing, for owner-occupied is so strong that it's inelastic, the price doesn't go down when the supply goes up.
So again, we're coming up with a list of barriers.
Yep.
We've come up with parking is one of the barriers. Dimensional is one of the other, is a barrier. I would contend that, as I say, wetlands is one, but I agree it's not something we're looking to do anything with, but it is a barrier. What other ones do we have that we can provide?
We got 2 more.
Yeah.
And they're easier.
Jo also has her hand up, I think.
Joanna?
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to lower it.
Okay. I know you have to leave a little bit. I just did want to say one thing on this tough problem of zoning in the residential neighborhoods. There are cities that have success stories where they've loosened the dimensional requirements, the frontages, the lot sizes, made it much more flexible. But then they've also created a handbook of it sort of character-based solutions. Like, here's how you could do a triplex in this neighborhood, and it's a drawing. And here's how you could do a duplex in this neighborhood. And, you know, I think Minneapolis has done a lot of that. So there are pathways to loosen up the zoning, but show how it's gonna work within neighborhood character.
And, you know, the other thing too is that, you know, I'm one of the few that, you know, I mean, I live in a new neighborhood. My neighborhood is only 25 years old. There is 100-foot frontage. If that had been reduced to 75 feet, would that make the houses more affordable? I don't think it would have really any impact on the cost of those houses. So, you know, that's the reality you're dealing with. All it does, it would make the developer make a few more shekels because they'd be able to put a couple more houses in. And that's, so, I mean, these are the things, this is the reality we're dealing with.
I think Mary's point earlier about comfort is really articulated well. I guess I would point to a place like Madison Street or Merrimack Street where there are, or Islington Street, there are a lot of converted Victorians that have 4, 5, 6 units in them. And those units are from, let's say, 650 square feet to 1,200 square feet. You know, at one point in history, that one building was for one family, and now it's for 6. And that's really cool. You know, that was, I'm sure, to someone's discomfort along the way, but it is now a great opportunity for housing. And now we're getting like 238 State Street is they're micro units. They're for sale, and I'm sure 80% of the people, if not 90% of the people in this room, or 100%, look at that and say, I would never live in that building because they're micro units and they have, you know, just not a ton of space, no storage, what have you. But to somebody out there, that is extremely comfortable and that works well. Did you design that building? Okay. So the comfort is a really interesting point.
Yes, it is.
While it cannot be quantitative in nature, it can still be effective. And that's why if you say you want to increase density by 10 or 20%, I think it's almost better to go the holistic route of what can we get people on board with? What can we get people comfortable with? Whether that's through demonstrative examples and illustrations or actual practice. So your zoning is not going to be perfect the first time you change it. It will be perfect as you make iterative changes and receive feedback, or like the ADU situation where we kind of noticed that we were not getting a lot of ADU applications, and then we changed something and now we got 7 or 10. And that to me is being receptive and understanding that no one in the city, no one on the boards and commissions, or no one on committees are going to be able to tell the future, but they have to be able to be humble enough to be like, yeah, we made some changes, we saw some applications, and maybe through those applications, we can react better and make more additional edits. And to me, that's how a lot of this comfort level will be seen and recognized.
Andrew, I'd like your point, and the fact is that, you know, we're talking about dimensional lots, probably, I won't even put a percentage on it, but 75% of those houses on Lincoln Avenue and Islington Street and all of those were all converted, and frankly, in most of them, they never got the proper approval process. People owned a big old house, they ended up putting, I mean, I can remember a friend of mine on Cabot Street bought a duplex, and within 3 months it was 4 units. Mm-hmm. I mean, they just went in and did it, and that's the way things were done, and you know, things have changed now, but I think that's an important point, and the fact is, as opposed to looking at lot size, dimension, height, and everything, how do we allow conversions like that, you know, take a house, you know, we've heard the discussions about people living in a big old house because that's where their family grew up with, you know, and now it's just a couple or one person living in this big house. I'll ask you, Peter, what is the barrier? What are the barriers for taking a piece of property like that and turning it into 4 units? And is that something that we should be talking about?
We do have, I'll pull up because I can't remember everything in the zoning ordinance.
Generally parking.
No, just a conversion of homes that were built before, I think 1989. You can lower the density if you convert it to, so many units. We have that provision in the ordinance, and people don't really take advantage of it, but we do have that. There are requirements you have to meet. You have to have the parking, and you have to meet building coverage and open space, but
So taking care of what we're proposing or what's being.
yeah, 1980. Yeah, so this section here allows you to convert, but it's not. You can't do it in the single residence zoning.
Okay.
So maybe making that more permissible.
Yeah.
In districts.
A good example of that is Admiral's Village in Kittery.
Admiralty Village, yeah.
Admiralty Village, where there is a mix of duplexes, triplexes, and single family, all in the same road. And you, to the naked eye, I guess, to somebody not in real estate, you might not be able to tell the difference between some of the duplexes and single families. And I think that's very interesting. It's granted a very concentrated area that was very intentional in that regard.
Right.
Same with Atlantic Heights, for that matter. And how you do that in a very natural way or comfortable or appropriate way without offending people is really interesting.
This gets kind of back to your point about
Any other,
neighborhood.
Yeah, as long as you honor the character of the neighborhood, I mean, people will grow comfortable with things pretty quickly.
well, a couple of things I'm hearing. We may not think a 600 square foot unit in a building full of an old house that's turned into 6 of those is where we'd want to live, but we're not 28.
You can also be 35 and enjoy living in one.
Well, shoot, you can also be 78 too. Like,
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with people. Just recently, a woman in the South End, single family house, 4 bedrooms, absolutely does not need it and is on the brink of not being able to live there just by mobility issues alone. And she's like, well, I want to stay in Portsmouth. Like, I want to rent something. I'm going to sell my house for $1 million and I want to rent something. And that is her ultimate goal is I want to downsize. I want efficiency. I don't want to be responsible. And how do I achieve that? That is a multi-million-dollar question that whether it's 600 square feet or it's assisted living or it's something that enables her to stay within her community, that is, again, not a quantitative issue, but primarily a lifestyle and quality of life issue that if we can find opportunities or inefficiencies within our zoning to create those opportunities for people in that area, whether you're 28 or 78, I do think that's a really important threshold issue to unlock not only housing inventory, but a ton of equity for folks and also opportunity for conversion and future change.
Take that house, sell it to someone who's going to develop it into 4 units, get an agreement that person, that the seller can
Gets one of the
stay in
units.
that unit for the rest of their lives, and you've solved her problem and provided somebody with an opportunity to create additional housing in Portsmouth.
There's 100 different examples. You can go all night on those ideas and those type of prospects, but it's all still subjective. I mean, people want to sell the houses for a lot of money, but they have to this stage because they say, where am I going to go where I'm going to be able to live that same type of so everything has an individual aspect to it, every case, and you can struggle with trying to figure out some type of uniform policy that you would like to develop, but there's always gonna be, you're always gonna bump up against something.
But Andrew's onto something, which is rather than looking at the technicalities of the code, look at opportunity areas. Like that Islington Street example is an opportunity. How can we replicate that opportunity elsewhere in the city? Well, then you go to the technical side and, you know, this use 1.6, which we already have, could be opened up to more neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think it adds another controlling element to the supply and demand question. In John's example of giving somebody a unit after you've divided up their building into however many units, at that point now it's the inquiry of that property owner that prompts a thought, rather than somebody just handing them a check and saying, see you later.
Yeah.
And to me, that's at least more of a participation and engagement for somebody than, hey, we just changed your zoning and now somebody's really gonna offer you a lot of money and they're still a capitalist pursuing their profits.
Property, yep.
So I think that's, I don't wanna totally go on a tangent here, but like that could ultimately be a problem solver rather than a problem creator, because if you just said, hey, we're gonna change the zoning and then hope for the best, that like obviously there are levels of engagement for that one individual or that comfort level, but it could ultimately enable somebody to see that bigger picture and go through a little bit of discomfort to yield a better solution.
I mean, we have the option now, to a certain extent. Again, let's just say that they didn't want to subdivide. Someone could buy the house and put up an ADU on it and let the person live in the ADU, and they're still in their same neighborhood with a smaller people, you know, again, if the lot allowed it. So anyways,
Well, if you're all okay with it, I think we've talked through lot sizes and dimensional requirements pretty thoroughly. There are two more that our memo has, and these are more simple map changes. You know, when we did the Gateway District, we converted, I think, about 300 or 400 acres of commercial land to mixed use. There's still a lot out there, not a lot, but there's still a fair amount out there. Constitution Avenue, Heritage Avenue, Banfield Road, some of these industrial areas, are they still good to keep it industrial? So map changes, review old commercial and industrial zoning districts for potential rezoning to mixed use, review residential districts for potential consolidation of districts. This should be done in consolidation with the lot size and frontage analysis. So that's essentially saying take the success with Gateway and keep doing it.
Yep.
works.
And, you know, when we get to our feedback from developers, some of these areas, there's no particular reason you need height restrictions. So we can talk about that as well. And the last one is our friends at RKG. As remember, we got a Housing Champion grant for them to look at our zoning and come back with ways to optimize for affordable units. So Peter, maybe you can.
Yes, they're doing an analysis on our incentives and gonna come back and give options for changing those incentives and what that would look like.
Right. So those are, but I think we've expanded the second one, the lot sizes and frontage, with some good discussion about ways that we can make that work.
Where would the conversion component fall on those two? What we were discussing about lifting some of their conversion restrictions, is that lot size? Because I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. It's probably picks up a couple of zoning, parts of the zoning code, right, Peter?
So that that conversion of older homes.
It's not prohibited now.
It's not prohibited now, but it's limited, it's not allowed in a lot of the single residential zones.
What about the homes built after 1980? Can those already be converted, or is it just the old homes?
No, it's just older homes. And then, so, it's only allowed in these districts,
Uh-huh,
and then you can lower the lot area per the density requirement. So for example, GRA currently has a 7,500 square foot lot area per dwelling unit. You could lower it to 3,000 square feet per
okay.
dwelling unit.
And if,
But maybe since that was 1980, maybe it's 1990,
what if it's just
or maybe it's just
2025? No, because like there are very, like my in-laws have what was initially an in-law apartment. So that could very easily become another unit. And there's whole swaths of neighborhoods that are parcels on huge lots or homes on much bigger lots that are 3,000 square feet, and those could very easily be.
So if you just get rid of the age of the home, that's just changing.
I would,
Just changing the use in that district to allow multifamily.
yes, I would argue.
We're looking at the density and lowering the lot size for the district. So it kind of all ties into reviewing everything.
All of it, okay.
Can I ask the obvious question? Why is it 1980 in the first place?
I would,
I don't know why that amendment was,
I-
when that was adopted and why it was chosen at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot is,
Because in 1980, that's when people started building really big houses.
that's when the McMansion
Yeah.
was
Green is
born.
good.
Right.
But I can, it's a good, something to
That's
find out
probably when-
why it was January 1st, 1980.
Houses with great.
Call Dave Holden.
yeah, I mean, if we could find a longtime resident prior to 1980, I'd be curious of their input as well. But,
And you guys, the Gateway expansion, I think.
Yeah.
That's a no-brainer.
That's no brainer.
Absolutely.
And then the RKG.
The gateway expansion being some of the business industrial zones.
I mean, you had the classic example, Andrew, of the building that's now the post office, Heritage Ave, which could have been housing if our zoning would have allowed mixed use.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also a pretty firm believer in time and timing, and as we just kind of talked about, like, what happened in 1980? I don't know, but what happened in 2025? I think you have to accrue enough data points and enough trend lines to make the informed decision or make the informed change so that you're not just doing it so reactive to the day that we are in, but historically understanding why certain things went into effect at a certain time. And yes, we are reacting to a severe lack of supply and very heightened demand, but we also don't want it to jump and start changing things that in 10 years from now, 15 years, 50 years from now, we're gonna be like, why the hell did we do that? So understanding those historic data points, it has to be done to then make the better outcomes or see out the better outcomes.
Yeah, I was reading about a city that redoes parts of its master plan every year.
Yeah.
They don't do it all at once, they do a rolling.
Yeah, I mean, even in 1980, I don't think the 95 corridor was there, even in some, I don't think it was there at all. Like Panaway Manor was entirely connected at that point, correct?
No, but it was.
I-95 was built by the Eisenhower administration.
The new bridge was early 70s.
So I think you look at other components outside of zoning, i.e. roadways, infrastructure, connectivity to utilities, that in turn is going to, again, inform your changing or ability to change. I don't see a whole bunch of new roads being developed necessarily, but there could be infrastructure capacity, there could be demand in a new area such as Constitution Avenue, which now has 95 apartments and 80 condos on it.
Yeah.
So more and more we are seeing that expansion take effect. Same applies to Route 1 across from Gitto's. And so even those data points would not be we wouldn't be able to review them until now. And people's comfort level, willingness, ability.
And I think, if I can, what we're doing is we're talking about what are the barriers. In order for something to be implemented, nothing's gonna happen as a result of what we're doing here. We're just raising issues. And for instance, if I can pick up on, what Mary said, the fact is that, if we look at allowing multifamily housing in more areas than we have right now, the neighborhood's still gonna have an opportunity to talk about it. And so the zone, again, if it's a neighborhood where they don't want multifamily housing, they will speak against that zoning.
It'll be a
and it
public
won't
process.
happen.
It'll be a public process. And hopefully the work that we're doing and the Places to Live dialogue did, keeping the awareness of the problem going.
Yeah.
Be some counterweight. Any more on that?
Just one comment, as we look at the map changes, I would consider, and I think this was in the master plan, trying to encourage density near transportation hubs, so near bus stops and parking areas and whatnot, park and rides, for example, might be more useful to promote lower cost of living.
For sure.
Welcome.
Thank you. Sorry, I got a flat tire.
Oh.
Made it.
Somewhere out in the boonies?
It was in Northampton, but
Oh, they have great cell service there.
they do.
Would other conversations around transportation, like bike lanes and stuff like that, come into this conversation as well? Just because even if there's not a parking lot, if there's a safe way to bike down Beverly Hill Road or Middle Street, that could also aspect.
Absolutely. I mean,
Or Islington.
there's a whole meeting we could have on transportation and the benefits of transportation.
But to expand on what Tracy was suggesting around more transit-oriented development, thinking about as part of the recommendations, looking into enabling different transportation options or having that in consideration of, I don't know totally how that all plays into zoning, but I was trying to yes and what Tracy was saying.
The updated bicycle pedestrian plan is just getting ready to be, it's gonna go to council in 2 weeks.
I can't wait to read that packet.
We've just got sidewalks, Route 1, across from the high school.
Well, they're 3/4 of the way there.
Because a fence got put up.
One of the things we talked about at the last meeting was that a smaller working group interview developers and get their feedback, and we developed some questions. And Councilor Moreau and the Assistant Mayor and I and Peter B. and Peter S. talked to Mark McNabb, Eric Chinberg, Tom Ballin. And I'll give you the quick headline version of some of the things that came across. It's very difficult, it's not very difficult, but it's difficult for developers to work with our inclusionary zoning, the 10% versus 20%. Particularly because right now, land is expensive, money is expensive, construction is expensive. One of the things they pointed out is our 80% of AMI is for an area that includes Rochester. So that brings the AMI down quite low relative to Portsmouth. So, the numbers don't always work when you get the high construction costs, the Rochester stuff. Now, this is just the feedback we're getting. And there was examples that they gave where there's flexibility in negotiating. Is it 80% of AMI, or maybe it could be 90%? Is it 10%? Or, let's say 10% of the units are affordable. Well, how much density, and can you make that extra density significant enough to pull the whole project into the black? And so the inclusionary zoning math is not one-to-one. It's not if you build 10 affordable units, the developer gets 10 more units of density. It's got to be more like 10 units of affordable and 25 additional units to make the project go. And I think there's a whole philosophical question of how much inclusionary zoning will really help us versus finding parts of the city where you can have real density increases like we're seeing in the GNOD. When you want to really scale up. So that was some feedback. Artificial constraints on unit size, getting down to 600 square feet, getting down to micro units of 300 square feet is a way to have naturally dense housing in the downtown. Well, which is important because it means that that project will be profitable and always exist as those micro units. It's not likely to be purchased and turned into luxury condos.
Depends on your definition of luxury.
Well, or as we're seeing on State Street, people buy 2 micro units and tear the wall out. The other feedback was a lot of these guys have in other towns used RSA 79E, which allows you to take a piece of land that's underutilized and the city gives 5 years of delayed tax, they give tax forgiveness for 5 years. That makes the project profitable. That's been a tool that's been used.
Would we need enabling legislation to do that in Portsmouth?
It's a good question. I don't think so, no. I think we just have to identify parcels.
Well, but like city staff could negotiate that.
Yes. Yes.
It's been discussed in a different manner with tax credits for sustainable components of buildings, like solar and things of that nature. So I would imagine it falls under the same kind of negotiation.
I don't know, Peter, do you?
Yeah, I don't know too much about that, but we can certainly provide more
It's a
information.
pilot program,
Yeah.
right? It's like
Yeah.
there's no payment in lieu of, but
Yeah.
it's a real estate tax incentive.
We talked to all of them about, well, actually, one of them said there's got to be some way to get a loan pool that's lower interest for affordable housing. That would be an intervention into the market that they as developers felt would help projects flow.
That's interesting.
And, we had explored that idea. And the model for that is over in Hanover. Moscoma Bank spearheaded that, and it's been successful in creating affordable housing units.
If I recall correctly, though, when we brought this up with the city lawyer, the city did not have much of an appetite for being a lender, and that would have to be private enterprise that was pulling their money.
Service Credit Union was exploring the idea of something similar.
Right.
And I haven't heard from them recently.
That's,
They would be like the perfect, it doesn't have to be city.
And that's such a
Driven.
viable option. Like that would
Yeah.
take off immediately.
And as opposed to going and working with an individual institution, I frankly would go to the New Hampshire Bankers Association, because it may take a pooling.
Right.
It may not, an individual bank may not be in a situation, but it may be a pooling situation. So, you know, I would think about looking at the Bankers Association as opposed to an individual institution. That's just a thought.
well, Councilor Moreau and I thought we would do some missionary work talking to banks to see if we could see what the interest is in that. You know, in the case of the Upper Valley, the large employers also put some capital to work. So Dartmouth Hitchcock said, yeah, we'll put in $1 million, or some of the Dartmouth College said we'll put in, because we need a workforce.
They've got a healthy endowment.
Surely would be a good place to see what the housing trust can accumulate to use as a basis, and then you start a loan program that you have 2 interest rates, one through the trust, one through a conventional bank. I know it's existed for over 25 years with fishermen. It was funded it was funded federally for a basis, and then the relationship with banks came up with a combination of rates. That money was, the federal money was lent out with prime +1, and then the bank came in with their interest rate. So I'm just saying that there's a variety of possibilities that could be explored, but you'd use the Portsmouth, you know, the housing trust is somewhat of a basis for exploring that, well, wherever it might grow. Right now, it's we know its condition right now, but it has prospect of growing.
What is so if there's tax forgiveness through RSA 79E, and our tax allocation is already contested via residential or commercial properties, are we just putting ourselves in a future date conundrum on that? Because we have to derive quite a substantial amount of money from our commercial tax bases. And so if we are giving forgiveness, is that not just delaying the issue?
It's not forgiveness, you just level set it, and then after 5 years, it goes back to market rate. So I don't think it's like in perpetuity, you're not getting the tax revenue from that
Right.
project. It's just you're saying, we'll give you a little break.
Short-term loss or long-term gain.
Depends on how you define little.
No, it's true, but we're using that in a project in Somersworth, and it has made the difference between a financeable project and not. And it's not forever. I think in there, it's 10 years, but.
Yeah, and it varies, which I'd never known. Like, if it's a historical building, you can extend it to 9 years. So there's different levels of loan forgiveness to incentivize different types of property.
And presumably this is underutilized land, so it was sitting fallow anyway. I mean,
100%.
I don't think there's much underutilized land in Portsmouth.
Yeah, that's the challenge for
There
us.
isn't.
But the tax revenue that the land generates does not decrease. It just does not increase in the same way.
Yeah.
Relative to the development.
Right, and presumably it gets built, you get 5 years of rent increases before the taxes.
And you joke about the underutilized land. There is. Like, through zoning, overnight, there could be underutilized land. And there still is by nature of some of our zoning today. Without any changes, there still inherently is opportunity with more value through more either owners, entities, or function to some of the properties that we have. I would say primarily commercial industrial buildings more than anything else, but without even changing some of those, you could just change some of the parameters that you need to hit to have those buildings.
Did any of the developers mention that?
Changing the zoning to make more, oh yeah. Because they you know, they view, well, as one of them said, land is scarce, use it wisely. So, you know,
Did you meet with them individually or did you?
one of them individually in sequence. The two last big points were they all view the putting parking into the site plan review as something that really removes a constraint. The parking tables that we have in our zoning ordinance.
And where does that stand?
That's near term. I think the planning board wants to move ahead with that.
Well, staff's working on it. It's complicated because parking is intertwined throughout the ordinance, so it's getting it ported over to the site plan regs, and then, so it's just,
In process.
it's in process, certainly.
And you would immediately understand this, Jen, but there's a view that most of the apartments being built are kind of the same formula, 4 to 5 stories, stick construction over a was it a pedestal,
Podium, yeah, sometimes.
and that
They're kind of ugly.
well, not
Okay.
that the Christmas tree shops, you know, could have been so much more density.
Yeah, maybe.
And so a number of them have in other locations gone up to 8 stories as we've anticipated in the GNOT. And 8, 9 stories, you have to have steel construction and you have to have elevators, but all of a sudden the numbers really work.
The GNOT's not 8 stories, 6.
Peter?
I think we allow.
6 with the incentive, or 6 and then you can go up after 6 plus?
I guess it doesn't really matter,
Right.
but yeah.
While we're looking for this, I just want to make sure that the public has a chance to speak before we
Yeah.
adjourn. They've been waiting.
Yeah, and we have one more item too.
That'll be quick. Oh, 2. Yeah, 80 feet.
But 6 stories? Maybe 8 stories.
6 stories, 80 feet.
Okay, that's where I had the number 8.
Was there any discussion, John, about bottlenecks at the staff level, where there just are a lot of requests on staff, and I'm particularly thinking of the legal department, and it's hard for them to turn things around in a timely manner? And I only ask because I wasn't at the last meeting. I did some of my own research with talking to people, and that was something that came up a couple times, was like, yeah, we need these easements in order to get going, and it just takes a very long time for us to get feedback on the easements. I know everybody's super busy, and I just wonder if that was part of the conversation.
Not so much. I mean, we were talking broader, what works, what doesn't work, not just Portsmouth, but
Yeah.
all the towns in the seacoast. But your point's a good one. We did talk about that permitting is easier to do with the folks the city now has than it was 5-10 years ago. And that was appreciated. So, but
You could probably speak to that more than I can, Tracy.
I can
It's
speak
always a
to
challenge.
that. Between the approval and building permit, there is a lot of post-approval stuff that needs to happen. But often it's after approval, there's a time period where nothing happens, and then at the end it's rushed, we gotta,
Yeah,
so if things would start as soon as the approval is granted, it gives time within that year to kind of move things along,
But I think our big takeaway was allow smaller unit size in the core of the city. Yes to the changes that the planning board wants to do with parking. Height is your friend. If there are parts of the city where we could look at greater height, that's a way to increasing supply.
Because the other thing on that, I mean, a million years ago, I served on the HDC, and I know that we had someone in the South End who said, I could build, according to zoning, I can build up to such and such. And we said, well, maybe you can, but the HDC says, no, you're not, because it's out of character. So, you know, those
Yeah,
things.
I should say that nobody thought you could foist that upon the historic downtown.
Yeah.
But Commerce Way,
Okay, yeah, that,
where the
okay.
only neighbor is an oil tank. It's not that hard. So,
Understood.
did I miss anything, Peter?
No, I mean, that's good. Those are the main points.
I mean, we asked and they gave us
Good.
their honest feedback, and
Excellent. And again, thank you for doing it, and thank those who were willing to provide you with the input.
yeah, I haven't written thank you cards yet.
You can sign my name too.
We had one last item. John, did you want to pursue that, or do you want to do that in the July meeting?
You said July, we can't.
Right, the
That's
July,
right.
the July 10th meeting, RKG is gonna come. It's gonna be in the city council chambers. But it's gonna be a public input meeting on their work with the OP2 grant and these incentives. So they're gonna give a presentation. Public's gonna be invited. We wanted the housing committee to be involved, so that's why we scheduled it.
Where our involvement is basically just being part of the general public.
Right.
Yeah.
So we'll send out more information on that when we get like a press release and stuff.
Okay.
All right.
So, John, you wanted to.
Pass.
You're gonna pass?
Pass.
Okay. We're always open to members who want agenda items, just get them to us.
Don't start.
We don't have 100% record of remembering those 3 weeks later, but. And public comment. Do you want to come forward, and we'll need you to state your name, Bill?
Bill Bowen, short comment. The premise of making better use of what exists is very important. The conversation is always around how to build more. But I think the discussion that Andrew and John kind of triggered on how to make better use of what we have, subdividing, there's gold there that often doesn't come in because not a lot of people are going to make a lot of money on it.
Thank you. Jim Smalley,
Yes.
name
Thank you.
and address, please.
Jim Smalley, 352 Kearsarge Way. This was a great conversation, this meeting, last meeting, et cetera. Just in simple terms, I had a whole bunch of notes, but we went from nuisance laws to zoning to prevent nuisance. And that's what drove a lot of the stuff from 1970 on. And that's why you see stuff like we can't do the changes in the single families out in neighborhoods, et cetera. I think the goal ultimately should be the most efficient use of land, optimal land use, period. Just as a guiding principle. Right now, if a piece of land could support 10 stories, you're gonna get 6 or fewer stories. If a piece of land could support 8 stories, you're gonna get 6 or fewer. That's not optimal use of land. The demand is there for height. And certain, like the historic district wouldn't apply. Supply matters absolutely. Whether that's a a single lot that divides in two and they make the most money, God hope they do, you're adding to supply. And that's important, even if it's 1 or 2 units at a time. What's interesting is, the 1.60, the subdividing the property into a different use, multi-use. Why not just allow it? I keep hearing the micromanagement and this character and that character, and you gotta make sure this happens, and everyone has an ice cream cone. We don't need to do that. There's dynamism within the markets. There's dynamism in the way a developer would develop a property. There's this belief that once you buy a property, if I were to buy a property today, the world stops. No change in the future. Let's kill dynamism. Let's kill architectural integrity, or development, or creativity. Let it flow. There's a tremendous amount of talent in this room, in the city, in the developers in this area. Let them realize their potential. And a lot of what we're doing is definitely in the right way. And one of the things I had, we have the incentive program. If you eliminate the height restrictions, you're going against the incentive, the workforce housing incentive. And that's why I thought it wasn't brought up at the last meeting. But the more you tax something, and that incentive, by the way, is a tax, because you're requiring payment in lieu, you're requiring land to be given up. The more you subsidize something, the more of it you're gonna get. It actually makes projects more affordable, and that's where you have the real estate fees. You're eliminating the real estate taxes, or eliminating them for 5 years, 6 years, whatever it is. That can actually offset the cost of a loan, the amortization of the loan, the interest costs, et cetera. Make things more affordable or profitable for the developers. You're not only get attainability, you're also going to get affordability. You have to satisfy that upper end, because if you don't, they can always outbid you, always outbid the lower level. So being able to at least get close to that, satisfy it, let the demand be met. We can't wait another 50 years to figure out what went wrong. We'll learn that over time. You're gonna have public comments and things like that. But too much public comment it just restricts. It stops. Use by right. Mixed use in all neighborhoods. Business use as well as multifamily. Just let it happen. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Okay. Thank you all for all the brain power tonight. Anything else?
Move adjourned.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.